My family gathered for a feast. That's the only way to describe the atmosphere in the days following my grandfather's funeral. They thought they were vultures, circling high above, ready to pick over the remains of a great lion's kill. They sharpened their beaks on gossip and entitlement, their eyes gleaming with the reflection of stock portfolios and property deeds. They had absolutely no idea that the lion, in his final quiet days, had already decided to leave his entire kingdom to the little mouse who had been faithfully tending to his wounds all along. And that mouse was me. My name is Clara, and for the last 3 years of my grandfather, Arthur Vance's life, I was his live-in nurse. To my family, this was a tragedy of my own making. At family gatherings, the few I could stomach attending, my cousins would corner me by the cheese platters, their voices dripping with a syrupy, condescending pity. "Clara, honey," my cousin Bianca would say, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. "You're throwing away your 20s. You should be out there, living, traveling, meeting someone, not this. This being the act of caring for the man who had given them everything." My aunts, Margaret and Helen, and my uncle Robert, were more direct in their own way. They saw my service as a convenience, a cost-saving measure that absolved them of any real responsibility. They'd send extravagant but useless gifts to the house and call it support. What they saw as my prison, the sprawling, silent Vance estate, was actually my sanctuary. What they heard as the incoherent ramblings of a dying old man were actually battle plans being drawn, a lifetime of secrets being passed from one generation to the next. Every night after the facade of their concern had faded with the daylight, my grandfather and I would talk. We would sit in the dim light of his study, and he would unravel the tangled, painful history of his life, his regrets, and his children's betrayals. The day after his funeral, they all gathered in that same study, their feigned grief evaporating under the heat of their greed. They expected a division of spoils. What they got was a reckoning. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that lawyer's office, the moment the world shifted on its axis and all their polite masks finally shattered, do me a quick favor. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated or overlooked by the very people who should have believed in you the most, please hit that like button. It's a small thing, but it helps to know you're not alone in that feeling. All right, are you ready? Let's dive into how it all fell apart for them, and how, in the wreckage, I finally found myself. It all started not with a bang, but with a sterile, soul-crushing family meeting. I had just graduated from nursing school, my cap and gown still hanging in a plastic sheath in my closet, a symbol of a future I thought was just beginning. My grandfather, Arthur, had taken a bad turn after a bout of pneumonia. He was home from the hospital, but he was diminished, fragile. The family convened in the formal dining room of the Vance estate, a room so cold and unused you could practically see your breath. My uncle Robert, the eldest and self-appointed new patriarch, stood at the head of the table, tapping a pen on a leather-bound notepad. "The reality is," he began, his voice devoid of any real emotion, "Papa needs round-the-clock care. I've had my assistant research the top facilities. There's a place called The Willows that has a 5-star rating." My Aunt Margaret, always obsessed with appearances, chimed in immediately. "Oh, I've heard of The Willows. The CEO of Sterling Cooper's mother is there. It's very exclusive." They talked about the cost, the logistics, the visiting hours. They talked about my grandfather as if he were a problematic piece of furniture they needed to move into storage. They never once used the word home. They used the word facility. I sat there, a ghost at the feast, listening to them discuss shipping him off. I thought of my grandfather, a man who had built an empire from nothing, who had commanded boardrooms and navigated global markets, being reduced to a line item on an expense report. I saw his fierce pride, his love for his home, for the scent of old books in his study, and the view of the ancient oak tree from his bedroom window. The thought of him ending his days in a sterile, unfamiliar room, surrounded by strangers, felt like a betrayal so profound it made my own chest ache. Before I even knew what I was doing, the words were tumbling out of my mouth. "I'll do it," I said. The chatter stopped. 6 pairs of eyes swiveled to look at me. "I'll move in. I'm a registered nurse. I can take care of him." A wave of palpable relief washed over the room. You could feel the tension drain away. Robert cleared his throat, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Well, Clara, that's remarkably selfless of you." Aunt Helen, the quiet one who used silence as a weapon, added, "It's a perfect temporary solution. It'll give you some practical experience while you figure out your long-term career path." They saw it as a deferment of my life, a convenient pause button that saved them money and guilt. They didn't see it as a choice born of love. They couldn't. It wasn't a language they spoke. So I packed my bags, left my tiny apartment, and moved into the guest suite of the Vance mansion, a sprawling stone edifice that had always felt more like a museum than a home. The early days were brutal. The Vance mansion wasn't dirty, but it was suffocatingly still, heavy with the weight of unspoken resentments and faded glory. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and something else, something like decaying paper or old grief. My grandfather was not the warm, smiling giant I vaguely remembered from childhood Christmases. Grief and illness had whittled him down, leaving behind a gruff, suspicious man who seemed to view my presence as an intrusion. He was a creature of rigid routine, and I was a disruption. He would sit in his high-backed leather chair in the study, a tartan blanket over his knees, and watch me with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He tested me constantly. He would ask for a book from the top shelf, knowing I'd need the rolling ladder. He'd watch to see if I was steady, if I was careful with the book's brittle spine. He would refuse his medication just to see if I would argue, cajole, or simply state the facts calmly and wait. "This pill," I'd say, placing it in the small cup beside his water, "is for your blood pressure. Doctor's orders. It's your choice to take it, but it's my job to make sure you have it." Then I'd leave it there and go about my duties. More often than not, when I returned, the pill would be gone. He never acknowledged it. It was a silent battle of wills, and I learned quickly that the only way to win was not to fight, but to demonstrate unwavering professional calm. He was a man who respected competence above all else, and I was determined to be nothing less than competent. For weeks our conversations were limited to his basic needs: tea, the newspaper, close the curtains. I felt like a servant, not a granddaughter, and a lonely one at that. The silence in that house was a living thing. It crept into every corner, every hallway. At night, the old house would groan and settle, and I'd lie in my bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if my cousins were right, if I had made a terrible, life-altering mistake. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday, about 2 months into my stay. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but a small, quiet one. I was organizing some of his papers in the study, sorting decades of receipts and correspondence into archival boxes. He was dozing in his chair, or so I thought. In a dusty box labeled personal, I found a small sepia-toned photograph. It showed a young, smiling woman with a familiar sparkle in her eyes, standing on a beach, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Beside her stood a much younger Arthur, not yet the titan of industry, but a lanky young man in uniform, his arm around her, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration on his face. I knew instantly it was my grandmother, Eleanor. I held the photo, a pang of sadness for the woman I'd never met echoing in my chest. "She loved the sea," a rough voice said from the chair. I jumped, startled. His eyes were open, fixed on the photograph in my hand. She said it was the only thing bigger than my ego. A flicker of a smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing. I walked over and handed him the picture. He took it with a hand that trembled slightly, his long, bony fingers tracing the outline of her face. "Eleanor," he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. She was the entire enterprise. I was just the engine. She was the compass, the map, and the harbor. That was it. That was the key. He didn't start telling me stories that day, but the door, which had been bolted and barred, had been unlocked. He started to see me not just as the nurse, but as Eleanor's granddaughter, a piece of her living and breathing in his house. A few days later, he asked me to read to him from the financial section of the newspaper. Then he started asking my opinion on the market trends. It was another test, I knew, but it was a different kind. He was no longer testing my patience. He was testing my intellect. The silent war was over. A quiet alliance was beginning to form. The family visits were a masterclass in performative affection. They'd sweep in once a fortnight, usually on a Sunday afternoon, staying for a carefully timed 20 minutes, long enough to assuage their guilt, but not long enough to be an inconvenience. My aunts, Margaret and Helen, would air-kiss the top of Arthur's head, their expensive perfumes clashing with the medicinal scent of the room. Uncle Robert would clap him on the shoulder a little too hard and ask booming, pointless questions. "Holding up, old man?" They brought gifts that were both extravagant and utterly useless. A cashmere blanket for a man who constantly complained of being too warm. An iPad for a man who mistrusted any technology invented after the telegram. A box of Cuban cigars for a man who hadn't smoked in 40 years. The gifts weren't for him. They were props, evidence of their supposed devotion. They'd talk at him, not to him, their voices loud and cheerful, recounting their latest European vacation or their children's accomplishments. My grandfather would just sit there, his face a stony mask, his eyes distant. The real performance would happen in the hallway as they were leaving. They would pull me aside, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "How is he really, Clara?" Margaret would ask, her eyes scanning my face for gossip. "Is he still all there?" Robert would add, tapping the side of his head. "You're a saint, Clara. You truly are," Helen would murmur. "We all tell our friends how lucky we are to have you. We'll make sure Papa remembers you in the will for all this." It was a casual, cruel little barb, a reminder that they saw my care as a transaction, a service to be paid for, and that they, of course, were the ones in charge of the payment. My cousin Bianca, who was a carbon copy of her mother Margaret, was the worst. She visited once on her own, dressed in an outfit that probably cost more than my first car. She wandered through the house, touching things, her expression a mixture of pity and disdain. "It's all so dated, isn't it?" she'd sighed, looking at my grandmother's beloved collection of porcelain birds. She found me in the kitchen, making my grandfather's lunch. "Clara, you look exhausted. You don't have a life anymore. Don't you miss just going out for brunch with friends?" "I have a life, Bianca," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "It's just not one that revolves around brunch." She gave me a sad little smile, the kind you'd give a stray dog. "Of course. Well, when this is all over, you'll have to let me take you shopping. We need to get you some new things." She meant it as a kindness, I think, but all I heard was that I was a charity case, a fixer-upper project she could take on once the old man was conveniently out of the way. I'd return to the study after they'd all left, the cloying scent of their perfume still lingering in the air, and find my grandfather looking at me. He never had to say a word. He knew. He saw it all. And in the shared silence, our alliance grew stronger. It was in those quiet evenings, after the charade of the family visits had ended and the house had settled into its nightly rhythm, that the real conversations began. It became our ritual. I would bring him a cup of chamomile tea and a small plate of biscuits, and he would begin to talk. At first, it was about the business. He'd have me pull down old, leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with his sharp, decisive handwriting. He'd point to a string of numbers. "See this? 1968. Everyone was investing in tech. I bought timberland in Oregon. They called me a dinosaur." He'd tap the page. "That land paid for your Uncle Robert's Harvard education and 3 of his failed startups." He wasn't just telling me stories. He was teaching me. He was showing me the foundation of the empire, the principles upon which it was built. Patience, foresight, and an unwavering belief in tangible assets over speculative bubbles. He talked about my grandmother, Eleanor, and how she was the one who taught him to see the value in people, not just in balance sheets. She was the one who started the employee profit-sharing program, he told me one night, his voice thick with memory. I thought she was a Bolshevik. Turns out it was the single most profitable decision the company ever made. Loyalty, Clara. You can't put it on a spreadsheet, but it's the most valuable asset you'll ever have. Then, slowly, painfully, he began to speak of the betrayals. He unspooled them one by one, like poisonous threads from a dark tapestry. He spoke of my Uncle Robert, his firstborn, the one he had pinned all his hopes on. He recounted a time in the late 80s when Robert, then a rising star in the company, had secretly funneled a huge sum of company money into a can't-miss real estate deal in Florida with a shady partner. The deal collapsed, of course, and the money vanished. He stood right where you are, my grandfather said, his eyes fixed on a spot on the Persian rug. And he lied to my face, said it was a clerical error, a bad wire transfer. I already knew the truth. I had the private investigator's report in my desk drawer. I never showed it to him. I just paid the debt, covered it up to protect the family name. But the trust, Clara, it was gone. It crumbled to dust right on that spot. He told me about Aunt Margaret, who, in a fit of pique after he refused to buy her a third home, had gone behind his back and sold a small, beautiful parcel of coastal land he and Eleanor had bought decades earlier. They had planned to donate it to the state to create a public park and bird sanctuary, a project my grandmother had dreamed of. Margaret sold it to a developer who threw up a gaudy condominium complex and used the money to buy a yacht. She called the boat My Way, Arthur said, with a dry, humorless chuckle. The irony was apparently lost on her. And then there was Helen, the quiet one. During a hostile takeover attempt in the mid-90s, a corporate rival had secretly approached her, promising her a seat on the new board if she would feed them inside information about Vance Industries' weaknesses. Thinking she was securing her own future, she did. Arthur, through his own network of loyal employees, found out and managed to fend off the takeover. He never confronted her directly. He just watched her. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the subtle shift from daughter to competitor. They don't lack intelligence, he concluded one night, staring into the dying embers in the fireplace. They lack character. It is my greatest failure. I taught them how to be rich, but I never managed to teach them how to be worthy. In those late-night confessions, I wasn't just his nurse or his granddaughter. I became his confessor, his historian, the sole keeper of a truth his own children refused to see. And with every story he told, the weight of his fortune felt less like a prize to be won and more like a sacred, heavy burden. As the seasons turned, my grandfather's physical strength began to wane. His steps grew more shuffling, his hands more prone to tremors. But his mind, if anything, grew sharper, as if all the energy that had once fueled his body was now concentrated behind his eyes. He was a lighthouse, the structure crumbling, but the light inside burning with a fierce, undiminished intensity. The family's visits, in a direct and sickening correlation, became more frequent. Their flimsy pretenses of concern wore thinner with each passing week, revealing the raw greed beneath. They no longer bothered with the useless gifts. Their questions became pointed and invasive. "Clara, does Papa keep his important documents in the study safe?" Aunt Margaret asked me one afternoon, trying to sound casual as she polished an already gleaming silver frame. "We should probably have the combination, just in case." I just looked at her. "I have no idea, Margaret. That's between him and his lawyer." Uncle Robert was even less subtle. He arrived one day with a sheaf of papers and a fountain pen, striding into the study where Arthur was resting. "Papa, just a little bit of housekeeping," he said, his voice slick and oily. "This is just an updated power of attorney form. It makes things easier, lets me handle the bills and such. Just need your signature right here." He pushed the papers onto the blanket covering Arthur's lap. My grandfather didn't even open his eyes. A single word, a rusty blade of a word, cut through the quiet room. Out! Robert froze. What? Get! Outside, Robert. Arthur's eyes opened then, and they were like chips of blue ice. And take your vulture claws with you. Robert, for the first time I had ever seen, was speechless. He gathered his papers, his face a mask of crimson fury and humiliation, and stormed out of the house without another word. The message was clear. The lion might be old, but he still had his teeth. The absolute nadir of their callousness came on my grandfather's 95th birthday. Against my strenuous objections, my aunts insisted on throwing a grand, ostentatious party at the mansion. I had pleaded for a small, quiet celebration. He'll be exhausted, I argued. It's too much for him. Aunt Margaret had waved a dismissive hand, a diamond bracelet rattling on her wrist. Don't be so dramatic, Clara. This is a milestone. It's for him to show him how much he's loved. You wouldn't understand these things. You're not used to entertaining. It was, of course, not for him at all. It was for them. It was a chance to fill the grand ballroom with their friends, to show off the family estate, to perform their roles as devoted children for a captive audience. They hired caterers who clattered through my kitchen, a string quartet that sawed away in the corner of the ballroom, and a photographer to document their filial piety. My grandfather was brought downstairs, dressed in a suit that hung loosely on his frail frame, and seated in a large throne-like chair. He looked small and lost in the sea of smiling, chattering faces. He endured it for an hour, his face pale, his smile a tight, painful grimace. In the middle of it all, as Margaret was giving a gushing toast about the greatest man we've ever known, Arthur's breathing became shallow. I saw the faint bluish tinge on his lips and knew he was on the verge of a medical crisis. I quickly and quietly administered his oxygen, my movements efficient and practiced. The family, however, was annoyed by the interruption to their party. Is he all right? Helen asked, her tone suggesting it was terribly inconvenient of him to be ill at his own celebration. As I was helping him back to his room, away from the noise and the suffocating press of people, I passed a small alcove where my cousins, Bianca and Leo, were hiding out with champagne glasses. They didn't see me. God, this is interminable, Leo muttered, loosening his tie. Poor old Grandpa looks like a wax figure. I know, Bianca whispered back, her voice laced with that familiar, poisonous pity. And look at poor Clara. She's practically a ghost. All that work, and for what? When this is all over, she'll have nothing to show for it but a 3-year gap on her resume and a bunch of sad memories. Honestly, we should probably all agree to set aside a little something for her from the estate. You know, out of charity. I froze in the hallway, the sound of their words hitting me like physical blows. Charity. A little something. They saw me as a pathetic creature, a project to be pitied and paid off. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt, which had been a dull, constant ache, didn't disappear. It crystallized. It hardened into something cold, clear, and strong. I helped my grandfather into his bed, settled him for the night, and then went back downstairs. The string quartet was still playing, the guests were still laughing, and I looked at them all, at their shallow, selfish world, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty distance. I was no longer a part of their world. I wasn't sure I ever had been. A week after the disastrous birthday party, my grandfather summoned a new kind of strength. It was a quiet evening, the house still recovering from the invasion of the party guests. He was sitting up in bed, the old ledgers open on his lap, but he wasn't looking at them. Clara, he said, his voice unusually firm, bring me the telephone. I need you to dial a number for me. He had me call Mr. Harris, his lawyer for over 50 years. He was a man from another era, quiet, precise, and fiercely loyal. He agreed to come to the house the following day. The news of the lawyer's impending visit sent a ripple of panic through the family. They descended upon the house the next morning like a flock of frantic crows, their faces etched with a mixture of greed and anxiety. "What's this about a lawyer?" Robert demanded, cornering me in the foyer. "Is he changing the will? We have a right to be present." "I have no idea, Robert," I said truthfully. "He just asked me to make a call." They insisted on waiting, stationing themselves in the living room, a silent, tense tableau of entitlement. When Mr. Harris arrived, a tall, gaunt man carrying a worn leather briefcase, they all stood up, ready to follow him into the study. My grandfather's voice, though weak, stopped them in their tracks. "Clara, show my children to the door. Mr. Harris and I have a private matter to discuss." The look of outrage on their faces was something to behold. They sputtered and protested, but the command was absolute. I escorted them to the door, my heart pounding with a strange, exhilarating sense of power. I closed the heavy oak study doors behind me, shutting out their world of noise and demand, and entered the quiet space of Arthur's trust. Mr. Harris was already seated opposite my grandfather. "Arthur," he said, his voice gentle, "it's good to see you." "You too, old friend," my grandfather rasped. "But we don't have time for pleasantries. I need you to open the safe." He gave Mr. Harris the combination, and the lawyer expertly spun the dial, opening the heavy steel door with a soft click. From a lockbox inside, he retrieved a thick vellum envelope, yellowed with age, its wax seal still intact. "You know which one this is," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Mr. Harris confirmed. "The amendment from April of 1998. My grandfather nodded. "Read it. Read it aloud. I want Clara to hear it." Mr. Harris broke the seal, unfolded the crisp, crackling paper, and began to read in a dry, legal monotone. He read a single devastating clause. It named each of his children, Robert Vance, Margaret Duval, and Helen Croft, and stated in no uncertain terms that they, along with their issue, were to be fully and irrevocably disinherited. The reason cited was a fundamental and irreparable breach of familial trust, and a demonstrated lack of the moral character required to act as stewards of the Vance legacy. The document had been written and signed 22 years ago, shortly after the last of their great betrayals. The sole heir named in the amendment was his wife, Eleanor Vance. My heart sank for a moment, but then Mr. Harris continued reading. "In the event that my beloved wife, Eleanor, should predecease me, her portion of the estate shall pass, per stirpes, to her direct descendants who are not otherwise explicitly excluded by the terms of this amendment." A long, weighty silence filled the room. Mr. Harris looked up from the paper, over the top of his spectacles, first at Arthur, then at me. I was Eleanor's granddaughter, but my mother was not one of Arthur's children. My father had been his fourth child, his youngest son, Michael, who had died in a car accident with my mother when I was just a baby. Michael had never disappointed his father. Therefore, I was not the issue of one of the disinherited children. I was the only one left. Arthur then dictated a short codicil, not to change a single word of the inheritance, but to insist that a personal letter he had written be read aloud after the will. When he was done, he dismissed Mr. Harris and looked at me, his gaze heavy. "They will hate you for this, child," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They will try to destroy you. Are you ready for that?" I thought of Bianca's pitying sneer. I thought of Robert's entitled fury. I thought of the years of casual dismissal. I looked my grandfather in the eye, the man who had shown me more respect and love in these last few years than his own children had in a lifetime. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The final weeks were a strange, peaceful coda to a turbulent life. The frantic energy of the family seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a tense, watchful waiting. The nightly conversations between my grandfather and me changed. The stories of betrayal ceased. Instead, he spoke of my father, Michael. He told me about his youngest son's quiet integrity, his kindness, his passion for astronomy, and his utter lack of interest in the family business. "He was the best of me and Eleanor," Arthur said one night. his voice filled with a profound, decades-old sorrow. He didn't want the company, he just wanted the stars. He told me that he saw my father's quiet strength in me, my grandmother's resilience. "This isn't about the money, Clara," he said, his hand gripping mine, his skin as thin as paper. "Never let them make you think it is. It's about character. It's a responsibility. I'm not giving you a prize. I'm passing on a torch I thought had been extinguished." In those final days, he seemed to make peace with his life, with his failures as a father, and with his impending end. The anger and regret that had fueled him for so long seemed to melt away, leaving a calm, quiet acceptance. He died in his sleep on a cool autumn morning, the sun just beginning to streak the sky with shades of pink and gold. I was the one who found him. I walked into his room with his morning tea to find him still, his face relaxed, free from the lines of pain and worry. In the profound silence of the room, I didn't feel the panic or chaos I had expected. I felt a deep, piercing loss, but underneath it, a sense of peace. His long battle was over. Mine, I knew, was just about to begin. The funeral was a grotesque piece of theater. My family, dressed in shades of expensive, somber black, played their parts with Oscar-worthy commitment. Uncle Robert, his face a mask of dignified grief, delivered a eulogy filled with soaring platitudes about a man he barely knew. He spoke of Arthur's business acumen and legacy, but said nothing of his love for bad puns or his secret passion for old Western films. Aunt Margaret wept dramatically into a black silk handkerchief, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes, while Aunt Helen stood beside her, a stoic, silent statue of sorrow. They offered me clipped, insincere condolences as they passed me in the receiving line, their eyes sliding past mine, already focused on the future, on the spoils. "You must be so relieved it's all finally over," Bianca whispered to me, giving my arm a squeeze. "Now you can finally get your own life back." The sheer, breathtaking irony of her statement left me speechless. My life, the one of purpose and meaning I had found within these walls, was the one that had just ended. The life she was picturing for me, empty, adrift, and poor, was one I had no intention of living. I just nodded, a quiet observer at my own family's circus. The main event, I knew, was scheduled for the following day. The next morning, we all gathered in the library. The air, usually smelling of old leather and wood smoke, was now thick with anticipation, a metallic blood-in-the-water scent of pure avarice. My aunts and uncles sat in the high-back chairs opposite Mr. Harris's desk, looking for all the world like a tribunal. My cousins, Leo and Bianca, perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, unable to sit still. Leo was surreptitiously looking up the auction value of a Remington bronze statue on his phone, while Bianca was mentally redecorating the room, her eyes flicking from the drapery to the carpets. They treated me like a part of the staff, expecting me to be in the background, to be invisible. Robert even had the audacity to gesture toward the sideboard. "Clara, be a dear and pour us all some coffee, would you? It's going to be a long morning." I didn't move. I simply took the empty armchair beside the fireplace, the one my grandfather used to sit in. A small act of defiance, but it sent a ripple of surprise through the room. They all looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in their eyes, before turning their attention back to the main event. Mr. Harris arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, his face as impassive as a granite cliff. He placed his briefcase on the desk and opened it with a series of sharp, definitive clicks. "Good morning," he said, his voice filling the silent room. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Montgomery Vance." He began to read through the standard legal preamble, his voice a dry drone. The family was practically vibrating with impatience. "For heaven's sake, Harris, can we just get to the numbers?" Robert finally snapped, unable to contain himself any longer. Mr. Harris paused. He slowly looked up from the document, peering at Robert over his reading glasses. "Patience, Robert," he said, his voice laced with ice, "is a virtue your father valued highly and found wanting. He then cleared his throat, his gaze returning to the page. Before we proceed to the disposition of assets as outlined in the primary document, I am legally bound to read a binding amendment, executed by the testator on the 12th day of April, 1998, and lodged with my firm on that date. He picked up the yellowed vellum envelope. A wave of confusion washed over the room. An amendment? From when? Mr. Harris began to read. He read the clause that systematically, brutally, and eloquently disinherited each of his children by name. The silence in the room became absolute, a vacuum. You could have heard a pin drop. Then it shattered. "What?" Robert exploded, leaping to his feet. "That's preposterous. It's a forgery. The old man was senile. He wasn't in his right mind. We'll contest this, Harris. I swear to God we will." Margaret began to sob, this time for real, her face contorting into an ugly mask of disbelief and rage. "He couldn't have, after everything we did for him," Mr. Harris continued, as if he hadn't heard them, his voice a relentless, steady metronome of doom. He read the part about the estate passing to Eleanor, and then the crucial per stirps clause. He paused for a moment of pure, delicious, dramatic effect, his eyes sweeping the room, passing over the furious faces of Robert, Margaret, and Helen, over the stunned, slack-jawed expressions of Bianca and Leo. His gaze finally came to rest on me, sitting quietly by the fire. "As Eleanor Vance predeceased the testator," he announced, his voice ringing with finality, "the entirety of the Vance estate, including all properties, assets, and holdings, passes to the sole qualifying heir, his granddaughter, Clara Annabel Croft." For a full 10 seconds, there was no sound at all, just the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the sound of their world ending. Then, Mr. Harris said, "Mr. Vance also left a personal letter, with the instruction that it be read at this time." Before they could even process the first bombshell, he began to read Arthur's final words. The letter was not angry. It was filled with a profound, soul-deep sorrow. He didn't just list their betrayals. He explained the pain they had caused him, the disappointment in their lack of character, the one currency he truly valued. He addressed Robert's lies, Margaret's greed, Helen's disloyalty. He wrote, "You were waiting for me to die so you could have my money. You never understood that the money was the least valuable thing I had to give." And then, the final paragraph. "In my final years, I was gifted with the presence of my granddaughter, Clara. In her, I saw the integrity of her father, Michael, and the strength of her grandmother, Eleanor. I saw a character that was not for sale. I am not leaving Clara a fortune. I am leaving her a responsibility, a legacy to be wielded with honor. It is a burden I place in the only hands I trust to carry it." When he finished reading, the dam of their shock broke, and a tidal wave of pure, undiluted rage flooded the room. The library, a room of quiet contemplation for a century, became a cauldron of shrieking fury. "You," Bianca screamed, her face mottled and ugly, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You did this. You poisoned him against us. You manipulated a sick old man." Leo, looking pale and nauseous, just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "All those nights," he stammered, "you were scheming. You were playing us all." The accusations flew at me like poisoned darts. I was a snake, a gold digger, a parasite. Uncle Robert, his face purple with rage, advanced towards Mr. Harris's desk. "This will not stand. We have a dozen witnesses who can attest to his declining mental state. You'll be hearing from our lawyers, Harris. And as for you," he snarled, turning to me, "you will never see a single penny of this. I will tie this up in court for the rest of your pathetic life." Through it all, a strange and wonderful thing was happening to me. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't intimidated. The part of me that had once craved their approval, that had withered under their condescension, felt like a distant memory, a skin I had already shed. I looked at their contorted faces, at the raw, naked greed and entitlement on display. and I felt nothing but a quiet, profound pity. They were like children having a tantrum, screaming because their favorite toy had been given to someone else. They had never seen the toy's true worth anyway. I remained seated in my grandfather's chair, my hands resting on the worn leather arms, and I simply watched them. My silence, my stillness, seemed to enrage them even more than any argument could have. Mr. Harris, a bastion of calm in the storm, waited for a lull in their screaming. He then spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise like a scalpel. A legal contest would be unwise, he stated calmly, arranging his papers into a neat stack. Mr. Vance, anticipating this reaction, underwent a full psychiatric and cognitive evaluation at the time the amendment was written in 1998. The evaluation, conducted by 3 independent specialists, found him to be of exceptionally sound mind. He requested and completed another such evaluation just 6 weeks ago. The results were the same. He paused, letting the information sink in. Any legal challenge you mount will be a fruitless, costly, and, I suspect, deeply embarrassing exercise in airing your family's private failings in a very public forum. He then stood, his work complete. He walked around the desk and stopped in front of me, ignoring the sputtering, furious family members. He handed me a single plain, white envelope. "From Arthur," he said softly. "He asked me to give this to you when it was all over." With a final curt nod, he picked up his briefcase and walked out of the library, leaving me alone with the wolves. Their threats and accusations continued for another 10 minutes, but their energy was fading, their rage turning into the impotent whining of the utterly defeated. One by one, they stormed out of the house, slamming the great oak door behind them, vowing revenge and ruin. And then there was silence, a new kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy, lonely silence of before. This silence was light, it was clean, it was mine. I sat there for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock in the hall. I looked at the envelope in my hands. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's familiar spidery script. I opened it. Inside was not a legal document or a set of instructions, but a single sheet of his personal stationery. The note was short. "They will not understand," it read. "Do not waste your breath trying to make them. Just be the woman I know you are. Your grandmother would be so proud. Start with the garden. She always loved the roses." I walked to the tall library window and looked out at the back of the estate. The once magnificent rose garden, my grandmother's pride and joy, was overgrown and choked with weeds. A beautiful thing long neglected. And for the first time since he had passed, a genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. It was time to get to work. The months that followed were a blur of activity. I didn't sell the house. I didn't run away to some tropical island. My grandfather had left me a responsibility, and I intended to honor it. The first thing I did was hire a team of gardeners and work alongside them, pulling weeds, pruning back the dead wood, and coaxing my grandmother's rose garden back to life. There was something deeply therapeutic about it, about bringing order and beauty back to a place that had been neglected for too long. I hired an estate manager and a small, dedicated staff who had been loyal to my grandfather, giving them raises and the job security they had feared losing. With Mr. Harris's guidance, I delved into the complex world of the Vance estate. I spent my days in the library, not as a nurse, but as a student, poring over the same ledgers Arthur had shown me. I learned about timberland in Oregon, commercial properties in Chicago, and stock portfolios that were as complex as ecosystems. But the most important work I did was not financial. I took the seed of my grandmother's old dream, the one my Aunt Margaret had so casually destroyed, and I gave it new life. I established the Eleanor Vance Foundation, a charitable trust with a massive endowment, dedicated to 2 causes close to my heart: providing scholarships for nursing students from low-income backgrounds, and funding innovative, compassionate end-of-life care initiatives. I wasn't living a lavish life, the sports cars and designer clothes my cousins would have bought, held no appeal for me. I was living a purposeful one, and it was more fulfilling than any luxury they could imagine. The house, once a silent museum of grief, slowly began to feel like a home. It filled with the sounds of planning meetings, the scent of fresh-cut roses, and the quiet hum of a legacy being rebuilt. Of course, the family didn't just disappear. After a few months of furious silence, the attempts at contact began. They were clumsy, transparent, and almost comical in their self-interest. The first was a phone call from Aunt Helen. Her voice was hesitant, syrupy sweet. "Clara, darling, I was just calling to see how you were. Coping. It must be so overwhelming for you, all of this." She didn't mention the will. She didn't apologize. She was testing the waters, seeing if the door was still open a crack. I was polite but firm. "I'm managing very well, thank you, Helen. I'm quite busy with the new foundation." The word foundation hung in the air between us. I heard her sharp intake of breath. She mumbled a hasty goodbye and hung up. Next came an email from Bianca, the subject line a simple, "Thinking of you." It was a long, rambling message full of fake sentiment and thinly veiled pleas. She wrote about how shocked and hurt they all were, how they were sure I must have been under a great deal of strain, and how they were willing to forgive the misunderstanding. Then came the pivot. Her husband's latest business venture had hit a temporary snag, and they were in a bit of a cash flow crunch. She didn't ask for money directly. She didn't have to. I replied with a single polite sentence. "I wish you the best in resolving your financial difficulties." I never heard from her again. The boldest attempt came from Uncle Robert. He coincidentally ran into me at a small cafe in town. He feigned surprise and delight, insisting on buying me a coffee. He tried to be charming, fatherly. He talked about his regret over how things had been handled. We were emotional, he said, stirring his cappuccino. Grief does terrible things to people. We said things we didn't mean. He then launched into a pitch for a new real estate development, a sure thing that just needed a primary investor. It was the same pattern, the same snake oil he had tried to sell his own father decades ago. I let him finish. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Robert," I said, my voice calm and even. "My grandfather left me this estate because he believed I had the character to manage it responsibly. Giving you money for another speculative scheme would be the fastest way to prove him wrong. It's not going to happen." The friendly mask dropped from his face, revealing the familiar sneer beneath. He stood up, threw a few bills on the table, and walked away without another word. Each of these encounters was a test, a new attempt to breach the walls I had built. And each time, I held my ground, not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty of my purpose. I was not a bank for their failures. The inheritance was not a prize to be shared. It was a tool, and I was finally learning how to use it. In the end, my cousins were right about one thing. My life was never the same after my grandfather died. They just got the reason completely, spectacularly wrong. They thought my years with him were a sacrifice, a period of my life I had thrown away on a dying man. They couldn't have been more mistaken. Those 3 years were not a loss. They were an education. They were the most valuable, most formative years of my life. In that quiet, lonely house, I learned about loyalty, integrity, and character from a master. I was given a gift far greater than money. My grandfather gave me his trust. He saw a strength in me that I didn't even know I possessed. And in doing so, he taught me to see it in myself. I am no longer the pitiable, overlooked Clara. I am the guardian of a legacy, the woman my grandfather trusted, the head of a foundation that helps people every single day. The pity I once saw in their eyes has been replaced by something else, a bitter, resentful envy. And I've learned to be perfectly okay with that. So let me ask all of you a question. What is the most valuable thing you have ever inherited from someone? It doesn't have to be money or property. It could be a piece of advice, a skill, a recipe, or a standard of character. I'd love for you to share your story in the comments below. I promise you, I read every single one. Thank you so much for joining me and for listening to my story today. If it resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding your strength when you least expect it. Always remember, your true worth is determined by your character, not by the opinions of those who are unable to see it.